Hi everyone, my name is Emily Carter. I'm Emily Tinitz for 4 pipes. And my name demons kin 20 thins. But we're you to 18 you the kin kind of Mariats. But before we begin, I want you to do something for me. Comment below and tell me which country you're watching this from. I really want to know how far this story travels. And if you enjoy real life style drill and stand. And well caned. It's guns but calm. Started with a behemoth has start a querhentin in your tiny nut any resemblance to real persons, events, or places is purely coincidental. No one in the quiet coastal town had any idea who the old man really was. To them, he was just another forgotten soul living in a cheap rented room near the docks. Someone who kept to himself, wore the same faded coat every day, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. His name was Arthur Hale, but no one cared to remember it. People saw what they wanted to see. An elderly man with no family around, no luxury, and no visible connection to anything important. What they didn't know was that Arthur's silence was not weakness, and his simplicity was not poverty. It was a choice, one that hid a past so powerful that if revealed, it would change the way every person in that town looked at him forever. Arthur had once been one of the most influential businessmen in the global logistics industry. Decades earlier, he built an empire from nothing, starting with a single warehouse and a borrowed truck. Through intelligence, discipline, and relentless focus, he expanded that small beginning into a worldwide network of shipping, storage, and transportation companies. His name once appeared in financial magazines, global business forums, and high-level government discussions about trade infrastructure. He was known for making deals that shifted entire markets and for solving logistical crises that even governments struggled with. At his peak, his wealth was measured in billions. But, more than money, it was his control over supply chains that made him powerful. If goods moved across continents, there was a good chance Arthur's system had touched them at some point. But power always attracts envy, and in Arthur's case, it came from the people closest to him. Years ago, a betrayal within his own inner circle forced him to make a decision that shocked the business world. Instead of fighting publicly or destroying those who had turned against him, he disappeared from his empire entirely. He signed over control of most of his holdings into blind trusts, removed his name from public records, and stepped away from the world he had built. Officially, it was called retirement. In reality, it was exile. He chose silence over conflict, distance over revenge. Many assumed he had lost his mind or gone bankrupt. The truth was far more complex. He wanted to observe people without the influence of his name, to see who would treat him with dignity when he had nothing left to offer. That was how he ended up in the coastal town. He chose it deliberately because it was far from the financial centers where his name might still be recognized. He rented a small, dimly lit room above an old storage shop near the docks. The ceiling leaked when it rained. The bed creaked with every movement, and the walls carried the smell of salt and rust. Arthur never complained. Every morning, he walked slowly to the nearby cafe, ordered the same plain tea, and sat by the window watching the sea. To anyone observing, he looked like a man waiting for something he had already lost. The landlord who owned the building saw him as an inconvenience rather than a tenant. The rent was low and Arthur always paid on time, but there was no respect in the landlord's behavior. He often spoke to Arthur in a dismissive tone, as if the old man's presence was a burden. Other tenants treated him similarly, sometimes joking about his quietness or assuming he had no family to care about him. Arthur never corrected them. He simply listened, observed, and remained calm. His eyes, however, always seemed to be studying more than just people. He paid attention to patterns, behavior, and small details others ignored, like who was greedy, who was kind, and who was dangerous when given even a little authority. Only one person in the town ever showed him genuine respect. A young woman named Elena who worked part-time at the cafe near the harbor. She noticed that Arthur never wasted money, never complained, and always left a small tip even when ordering the cheapest item on the menu. Unlike others, she didn't assume things about him. Sometimes she would ask simple questions about his life, and although he rarely gave direct answers, she sensed there was something deeper behind his calm voice. Over time, she became the only person he spoke to regularly. Arthur trusted her just enough to share fragments of his past, but never the full truth. Even then, he carefully watched her reactions, as if evaluating whether she could be trusted with something far greater than conversation. One ordinary evening, everything began to shift without warning. Arthur returned to his room after his usual walk by the sea. The sky was gray, and the wind coming from the ocean was unusually strong. He noticed something different as he climbed the narrow stairs to his rented space. The hallway felt colder, and there were unfamiliar footsteps near his door. When he reached it, he saw that the lock had been tampered with. Before he could react, the landlord appeared behind him holding a folded paper, his expression unusually tense. He said nothing at first, only handed Arthur the paper and told him that there had been a legal issue regarding his tenancy. The document was vague, filled with technical language, but the message was clear. He was being evicted immediately due to alleged financial discrepancies and verification concerns raised by an external party. Arthur read it slowly, his face unchanged. He asked no questions. He did not argue. Instead, he placed the paper back into the landlord's hand and quietly entered his room. Inside, he looked around at the few belongings he had accumulated over the years. A small suitcase, a worn coat hanging on a nail, a few books, and a locked wooden box that he never allowed anyone to touch. He sat down for a moment, as if confirming something only he understood. Then he stood up and began packing without hesitation. There was no panic, no anger, only a strange sense of acceptance, as if this moment had already been anticipated long before it arrived. Outside his window, the sound of waves crashing against the shore mixed with distant voices in the hallway. As he folded his coat and placed it into the suitcase, he paused briefly and looked toward the sea, his expression calm but unreadable, as if calculating not what he was losing, but what this loss would allow him to do next. By the time Arthur Hales stepped out of the building, the atmosphere in the coastal town had already begun to shift in subtle but unsettling ways. The eviction had been carried out with unusual speed, almost as if it had been pre-planned rather than triggered by a simple complaint. Within hours, his small room near the docks was emptied. The landlord had instructed 2 workers to remove everything without care or caution. Arthur's belongings were thrown into old cardboard boxes, then dragged down the narrow staircase and placed on the roadside as if they carried no value at all. The wooden box he always kept locked was placed on top of the pile, slightly scratched from the rough handling. People passing by glanced at the scene briefly, but did not stop. To them it was just another old tenant being removed, another quiet story ending without importance. Word spread quickly among the nearby residents. Some said Arthur had failed to pay rent, others claimed he had been exposed for hiding debts, and a few even suggested he had been involved in something suspicious and was being removed for legal reasons. None of these rumors were based on fact, but in small communities, speculation often replaces truth. The landlord himself added fuel to the situation, telling anyone who asked that the old man had been living beyond his means, and that the eviction was necessary for financial compliance. There was a strange satisfaction in his voice, as if he believed he had uncovered something significant, even though he had no idea who Arthur really was. Arthur, however, did not react like a man who had been defeated. He walked slowly down the street carrying only his suitcase, as though the eviction had been a scheduled departure rather than a forced removal. His expression remained steady, and his pace was controlled. There was no visible anger, no desperation to retrieve what had been taken. Instead, he seemed to be observing everything around him with heightened awareness. Every face that turned away from him, every whispered comment, every indifferent glance, was being stored somewhere in his memory. It was not emotional reaction, it was analysis. That evening, as the sun began to set over the harbor, Arthur found himself sitting alone on a wooden bench near the water. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of salt and rusted metal from the ships anchored nearby. He placed his suitcase beside him and leaned slightly forward, watching the waves crash against the docks. For most people, this would have looked like a man with nowhere to go. But Arthur's posture suggested something different. He was waiting not for shelter, but for timing. Every so often, he glanced at the town behind him, where lights were beginning to turn on in windows and streets. Life continued normally, unaware that something beneath its surface had already begun to change. A few blocks away, Elena had already noticed the unusual situation. She had seen the removal of Arthur's belongings earlier in the day and immediately felt that something was wrong. It was not just the eviction itself, but the way it had been handled. Too fast, too coordinated, and strangely aggressive for someone who had always paid rent on time without complaint. She knew Arthur better than most in the town. He often visited the cafe where she worked part-time, and although he was quiet, he had never shown signs of instability or financial distress. Without hesitation, she decided to follow the situation more closely. By nightfall, Elena was sitting in a parked car across from the harbor bench, where Arthur was resting. She had made a call earlier that afternoon to a private contact, someone who had previously warned her that Arthur was not an ordinary man. The response she received was simple but alarming. "Do not intervene yet. Observe." That instruction only increased her suspicion. Watching Arthur from a distance, she noticed that he was not behaving like someone who had lost everything. He was calm, composed, and strangely patient, as if the eviction had not disrupted him at all, but instead activated something within him. At one point, Arthur stood up and walked toward the edge of the dock. Elena instinctively stepped out of her car, ready to approach him, but stopped when she saw him pause and look out at the sea. He was speaking quietly to himself, though no words could be heard from where she stood. His hand rested on the suitcase beside him, and for a brief moment, he seemed almost detached from the physical world around him, as if mentally mapping something far beyond the town itself. Then he turned slightly and noticed Elena watching him. Instead of reacting with surprise or frustration, he simply nodded once, acknowledging her presence. When she finally approached him, she tried to offer help, suggesting temporary shelter or support. Arthur refused politely but firmly. His voice carried no bitterness, only certainty. He told her that what had happened was not an accident, and that she should not involve herself unless she was prepared for consequences she did not fully understand. When she asked what he meant, he did not explain. Instead, he looked back toward the building where he had been evicted earlier, and said that some actions reveal more about people than years of observation ever could. Later that night, as the town grew quieter and most lights were turned off, Arthur remained near the waterfront. Elena stayed nearby in her car, unable to leave. At exactly midnight, Arthur received a message on an old, hidden device he carried in his coat pocket. It was brief, encrypted, and contained only a single confirmation code. He read it once, then closed the device and stood up. His expression changed slightly, not into anger or excitement, but into something closer to resolution. The next moment, he took out a small key from his pocket and looked at it for a few seconds before placing it back safely inside his coat, as if preparing for something that had been set in motion long before the eviction ever occurred. By the second morning after Arthur Hale's eviction, the town near the coast began to feel different, even though most people could not explain why. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Shops were open, fishermen continued their work, and vehicles moved through the narrow streets as usual. But behind this routine, small disruptions had started to appear in places where people least expected them. A few local businesses noticed delays in their banking transactions. One of the larger suppliers at the port reported that their shipping clearance had been unexpectedly paused without explanation. At first, these issues were dismissed as technical errors, but as the day progressed, more and more irregularities surfaced. The landlord who had ordered Arthur's eviction was the first to experience something that truly unsettled him. Early in the morning, he received a notification from his bank, stating that his primary accounts were temporarily frozen due to a compliance review. There were no further details provided. When he tried to contact his bank manager, he was told to wait for an official investigation team to respond. Confused and irritated, he began making calls, trying to understand what was happening, but every response was vague. By midday, 2 of his smaller property transactions had also been suspended. It was as if invisible pressure was building around his financial life, cutting off access step by step. At the same time, across the town, a real estate development company that had been preparing to acquire several buildings near the docks suddenly received a legal notice. The notice stated that the ownership chain of multiple properties had been flagged for verification under a larger corporate restructuring review. The company's executives were shocked because these properties had always been considered stable and legally clean. What they did not know was that many of those holdings were indirectly connected to dormant investment structures linked to Arthur Hale's old empire. Those structures, inactive for years, were now quietly being reactivated through legal channels that had remained invisible until that moment. Arthur himself remained unseen by most of the town that day. He was no longer staying at the harbor bench. Instead, he was inside a quiet private space near the outskirts of the coastal region, arranged for him by Elena. The room was simple, but it had secure communication lines and access to encrypted systems. Elena stood beside him as multiple screens displayed financial movements across different regions of the world. She had seen unusual activity before, but never at this scale. Large corporate accounts were being audited simultaneously, international transfers were being paused, and several high-level asset managers were requesting emergency clarifications from legal departments they had not used in years. Arthur watched everything without visible emotion. To anyone observing him, he looked like a man calmly reviewing data. But in reality, he was observing a system he had once built being carefully reawakened. Years ago, when he stepped away from his empire, he did not completely dismantle it. Instead, he divided control into multiple silent layers, each designed to remain dormant unless triggered through specific legal and encrypted conditions. Most people assumed those systems had become irrelevant over time. But Arthur had ensured they would remain intact, untouched, and unnoticed until the right moment arrived. Elena broke the silence at one point and asked whether what was happening in the town was intentional. Arthur did not answer immediately. Instead, he reviewed a sequence of transaction logs that showed a sudden freeze on the landlord's financial portfolio, followed by a series of blocked real estate transfers tied to his name. After a few moments, he finally spoke, saying that systems do not act on emotion. They respond to authorization. This was not chaos. It was structure unfolding as designed. By afternoon, the situation in the town escalated further. The landlord was called into a government office after irregularities were discovered in his property tax records. What began as a routine inquiry quickly expanded into a deeper financial audit. Inspectors began examining multiple buildings under his ownership, including the one where Arthur had lived. Within hours, they found inconsistencies in reported income, undocumented tenant agreements, and suspicious financial transfers connected to offshore accounts. The landlord, who had previously felt powerful in a small domain, suddenly found himself overwhelmed by a system far larger than anything he controlled. Meanwhile, rumors began spreading among residents that something unusual was happening behind the scenes. Some said a major corporation was entering the region and acquiring assets. Others believed a legal crackdown was targeting corrupt property owners. No one connected these events to Arthur because, in their minds, he was still just the quiet old man who had been evicted 2 days earlier. That assumption allowed the real transformation to continue unnoticed. In the evening, Elena received an encrypted message confirming that multiple dormant accounts tied to Arthur's legacy holdings had been successfully reactivated. The scale of these holdings was far beyond anything she had fully understood before. They included shipping networks, infrastructure investments, and private equity control over logistical corridors spanning several continents. The activation was subtle but irreversible, like a dormant machine slowly powering back to life after years of silence. Arthur stood by the window as he reviewed the final reports of the day. The city lights in the distance flickered softly, reflecting off the water. He observed everything quietly, as if measuring the consequences of each action unfolding in real time. There was no urgency in his movements, only precision. When Elena mentioned that several international executives had begun asking questions about the sudden restructuring, Arthur simply replied that questions usually come after decisions, not before them. As night fell, the full impact of the financial shifts had not yet reached public awareness. But inside corporate offices, legal departments, and banking institutions, alarms were already being raised. something large had been set in motion. Something that no one in the coastal town yet understood. And the source of it all remained hidden behind the calm presence of an old man who had been thrown out without a second thought. By the morning of the third day, the coastal town was no longer operating under its usual rhythm. What had started as minor financial disturbances and unexplained delays had now turned into full-scale institutional panic. Banks were holding meetings behind closed doors, property owners were receiving urgent legal notices, and local authorities were being quietly instructed to monitor several key individuals connected to recent financial anomalies. The name Arthur Hale still did not appear in any public statement, but his influence had already begun reshaping everything around the town in ways no one could fully understand. The landlord who had evicted Arthur was now at the center of a growing investigation. He had spent the previous night trying to restore access to his frozen accounts, but each attempt only led to further restrictions. By morning, he was summoned to a regional financial compliance office under the pretense of a routine audit. When he arrived, he quickly realized it was not routine at all. Multiple investigators were already waiting, and they began questioning him about property ownership records, tenant agreements, and financial transfers linked to his real estate holdings. At first, he tried to defend himself, insisting everything was legal and properly managed, but the investigators had documents that contradicted his claims. As the questioning continued, the scope of the investigation widened. Several of his properties, including the building where Arthur had lived, were flagged as part of a larger network of suspicious financial structuring. The officials did not reveal the full details, but it became clear that his assets were tied to a chain of ownership that extended far beyond the local area. The landlord, who had once considered himself powerful within the town, suddenly found himself overwhelmed by questions he could not answer and systems he did not understand. At the same time, across the harbor, something even more unusual was unfolding. Private aircraft had begun arriving at a nearby restricted airstrip, carrying individuals from international financial institutions and corporate law firms. These were not ordinary visitors. They were senior representatives of global organizations that rarely interacted directly with local authorities. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the region. Government officials were instructed to clear meeting rooms, and emergency discussions were held about the sudden activation of dormant corporate structures linked to a name that had been absent from public records for years. Inside one of these temporary command offices, documents were being reviewed that connected multiple offshore entities, shipping routes, and investment portfolios. The pattern that emerged pointed toward a single controlling origin, though no one initially wanted to accept it. The name Arthur Hale appeared repeatedly in archived records, but most believed it was impossible for him to be involved. He had been inactive for years, officially retired and removed from all visible corporate roles. Yet the financial movements unfolding over the past 48 hours all traced back to structures originally established under his control. Arthur himself remained out of public sight, staying in a secure location arranged by Elena. The space was quiet, isolated, and equipped with encrypted communication channels that allowed him to monitor global reactions in real time. Screens displayed live updates from financial institutions, legal departments, and corporate boards reacting to sudden asset restructuring events. Elena moved between systems, tracking responses from different countries, and each new update confirmed the same pattern. The systems that had been dormant were not only active again, but operating with full authority. Elena finally asked Arthur directly whether the world was now witnessing his return. Arthur did not immediately respond. Instead, he reviewed a report showing the landlord's escalating legal troubles and the widening scope of the investigation into local property networks. After a pause, he said that the world was not witnessing his return, but rather the consequences of assumptions made without understanding the structure behind what they controlled. His tone was calm, but his words carried a clear meaning. What people saw as sudden disruption was actually a correction of long-standing imbalances. By midday, the situation escalated further when a group of senior corporate representatives arrived by helicopter at the coastal outskirts. Their presence was highly unusual for such a small town, and within minutes, local authorities were instructed to secure the area. These individuals were former board members and high-level executives from Arthur's past empire, people who had once worked directly under his leadership. Their arrival was not driven by authority, but by urgency. They had received internal alerts confirming that dormant asset structures had been reactivated, and that only Arthur could authorize or reverse the changes now unfolding. They gathered in a temporary meeting facility near the harbor, where officials tried to coordinate communication between government bodies and international financial institutions. However, the representatives made it clear that their intention was not negotiation but acknowledgement. They were there to confirm Arthur's status and seek direct communication. What had begun as a local eviction incident had now escalated into a situation involving global financial governance systems. Elena informed Arthur about their arrival and their request to meet him. For the first time since the eviction, Arthur's expression shifted slightly. It was not surprise, but recognition. He understood that the phase of silent observation was ending. The system he had reactivated was now visible to those who once believed it was permanently out of reach. However, instead of agreeing to meet them immediately, he instructed Elena to delay any direct contact. He wanted them to understand the weight of the situation they had triggered before they were given access to him again. Meanwhile, the landlord was released temporarily under supervision, but his situation had worsened significantly. Authorities had uncovered irregular financial patterns suggesting long-term misconduct, and his assets were now under full restriction. The same man who had confidently ordered Arthur's eviction just days earlier was now facing legal exposure that threatened to dismantle everything he had built locally. As evening approached, the town was surrounded by quiet tension. Residents noticed unusual security presence, unfamiliar vehicles, and restricted access to certain areas. Rumors spread quickly, but no official explanation was given. In offices and temporary command centers, discussions continued late into the night about the origin of the financial restructuring events. Despite all the data available, there was still reluctance to accept that the source could be a single individual who had been dismissed as irrelevant only days earlier. Inside the secure location, Arthur stood near the window, observing the distant lights of the town. Elena stood behind him, reviewing final updates confirming that multiple global asset channels were now fully synchronized under restored authority protocols. Everything was in place for the final phase of escalation. Arthur remained silent for a long moment, then turned slightly toward the screen displaying the approaching representatives, acknowledging that the moment of confrontation was now unavoidable and the system he had awakened was no longer operating in the shadows, but fully active across every level of control. By the time the fourth day arrived, the coastal town no longer felt like the same place that had casually thrown an old man out onto the street just a few days earlier. The change was not loud or chaotic in the way people expected major events to be. Instead, it was quiet, structural, and deeply unsettling. Businesses that had operated for decades suddenly found their ownership records under review. Several major financial accounts linked to local investors were now frozen or under legal observation. Even simple transactions at the harbor required additional verification. People could sense that something large had shifted, but no one had a clear explanation, and the official statements from authorities were vague and carefully worded. Arthur Hale was no longer on the streets or in any public place. By this point, he was staying in a secured Ocean View estate that had once belonged indirectly to one of his dormant holding structures. The transition from anonymity to control had not been dramatic for him. It was procedural. Systems that had been inactive for years were now fully synchronized under his authorization. What others saw as sudden financial chaos was, for Arthur, simply the execution of pre-existing protocols designed long before the eviction ever happened. He stood in silence for most of the morning, observing digital reports that confirmed the complete reorganization of multiple asset networks across different regions. Elena remained by his side, monitoring global responses. She had seen financial operations before, but nothing at this scale felt personal in the same way. Every update confirmed the same reality. Institutions that had ignored Arthur's existence for years were now urgently trying to trace how so many independent systems had aligned under a single authority without warning. The most powerful corporations involved were no longer issuing demands or threats. Instead, They were requesting meetings, clarifications, and temporary pauses to the restructuring process. But Arthur had already made it clear that the process would not be reversed. In the town itself, the consequences were becoming visible in everyday life. The landlord who had evicted Arthur was now under full legal restriction. Investigators had uncovered enough financial irregularities to detain him formally. His properties were sealed, his accounts inaccessible, and his influence in the town had collapsed completely. People who once followed his instructions without question were now distancing themselves from him. The same individuals who had laughed at Arthur's eviction were now quietly trying to avoid attention, realizing too late that they had misjudged the situation entirely. As news spread, residents began to piece together fragments of what had happened. They heard rumors of international corporations involved in sudden asset restructuring, of government-level audits triggered by unknown financial patterns, and of a hidden controlling entity behind it all. Still, no one connected it directly to Arthur at first. In their minds, he remained the quiet, insignificant old man who had been removed without resistance. That misunderstanding allowed the final stage of the shift to unfold without interruption. By midday, a group of high-level representatives arrived at the coastal region once again. This time, they were not observing from a distance. They were formally requesting access to Arthur. These individuals were former executives and board members from his earlier empire, now acting as intermediaries between global institutions and the reactivated asset network. Their presence created immediate tension in the local administrative offices, as even regional officials struggled to understand why such powerful figures were gathering in a small coastal town. Arthur reviewed the request calmly. From his position, he could see every communication channel, every legal filing, and every corporate response being generated in real time. The entire system had reached a point where refusal or acceptance of meetings no longer mattered. The structure was already active, and its effects were irreversible. After a brief pause, he instructed Elena to allow them to approach, but only under controlled conditions. He did not want emotional reactions or rushed apologies. He wanted clarity, accountability, and recognition of the structure they had ignored for years. When the representatives finally arrived at the secure estate, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. These were individuals who had once worked directly under Arthur when his empire was at its peak. Some of them had been part of the system that eventually contributed to his withdrawal from public life. Now they stood in front of him, not as equals, but as people confronting the consequences of systems they had forgotten existed. Their initial attempt was to explain the current financial situation, to discuss potential solutions, and to request stabilization measures. However, Arthur stopped them before they could continue. He reminded them that what they were experiencing was not a crisis but a correction. The systems they were trying to negotiate with had not been created recently. They had been designed years earlier to remain dormant until specific conditions were met. The eviction had not triggered revenge in the emotional sense. It had triggered authorization conditions embedded within legal and financial frameworks, long before any of them had assumed he was no longer relevant. His tone was steady, without anger or satisfaction, as if he were simply explaining the function of a machine. The representatives quickly realized that negotiation was not the correct approach. Instead, they shifted to acknowledgement, confirming that they understood the activation protocols and requesting guidance on how to stabilize global markets affected by the restructuring. Arthur listened but did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked toward the horizon, where the ocean stretched endlessly beyond the estate. The silence that followed carried more weight than any agreement or disagreement. Back in the town, the final visible collapse of the landlord's influence was complete. His name had been removed from multiple property registries, and his remaining assets were either frozen or reassigned. People who once feared him now treated him as a cautionary example of unchecked authority. The building where Arthur had once lived stood empty, its ownership transferred into a larger holding structure that no longer recognized local control. Elena observed all of this quietly, aware that what had begun as a simple eviction had expanded into a transformation that affected multiple systems far beyond the coastal region. She asked Arthur whether he intended to restore things to how they were before. Arthur did not answer directly. Instead, He stated that systems do not return to previous states once they have been corrected. They evolve into new structures based on what has been revealed. His paid dicken. Though hårdert fismat might waldemter whatever a dark pretend of a wood a pound, and an every sempent fermented that with the pervented epic was one fermentout reari, but one permanent the ferment with fongt. But the part with Eviction hat was stubber revenge wemst, it was about slikes tank heat. What can how quick at a camp sabiats I survived, for it's so shared.